So one of the main functions of this LA County emergency declaration is it will allow local officials to provide rent relief to people who have fallen behind because of these immigration raids. And as these raids continue, a lot of officials say immigrants, many of them, are not going to work. They are staying home out of fear.
Yeah.
Robin?
Oh, all right, Trevor. Thanks to you.
This was not a traffic enforcement action, the federal briefer said, voice tight and unblinking. This was a supply chain seizure. And then the anchors landed like iron. 4:07 a.m., Los Angeles, California. 8.2 tons of narcotics pulled from a taxi and trucking empire. 400 fleet vehicles seized or immobilized. $500 million in cash, crypto, gold, and property holds triggered across the region. 61 primary suspects detained in the first wave, and a corruption flag raised on a circle of officials who were supposed to regulate the streets, not secretly sell them. The briefer called it the most dangerous municipal infiltration investigators had seen in years, because the CJ&G cartel didn't just hide inside the city, it moved like the city. And if you're listening right now, understand the warning. What they found in Los Angeles wasn't just a drug cartel using a fleet, it was a fleet acting like a government agency, a machine with dispatchers, permits, inspectors, and paperwork that could reroute narcotics the way a normal company reroutes passengers. And the next part is worse, because the deeper the bureau dug, the more it looked like the city had been quietly reconfigured into a drug empire hub, not by street shooters, but by a smiling official who knew how to pass a vote. At 4:32 a.m. the air above Los Angeles sat heavy and gray, marine layer pressed down on the freeways, neon from late-night storefronts bled across wet pavement, and the city sounded muted as if somebody had turned down the volume to hide what was about to happen. And that's when the coordinated strike teams moved, FBI, DICE, DHS, and SWAT elements sliding through industrial corridors and parking lots without sirens, unmarked SUVs shadowing box trucks, tactical vans rolling behind them like a second set of headlights you weren't meant to notice. And if you could have seen it from above, you would have watched the operation unfold like a net tightening, because the targets weren't random, they were nodes. A dispatch center disguised as a taxi call hub, a fleet maintenance warehouse that never serviced a single legal vehicle, a chain of driver training schools used to credential cartel couriers, a pair of cash-heavy nightlife fronts near Koreatown that functioned as counting rooms, a massage front corridor used to stash fentanyl pills and move human trafficking victims, and a hidden narcotics transfer yard tucked between rail lines and container depots where trucks could vanish into the logistics noise. At 4:33 a.m. the first breach hit a warehouse door stamped with a cheerful logo and an empty slogan about moving LA safely. A small charge popped. The door folded inward, flashbangs split the darkness, and agents in black flowed through the opening like shadows becoming real, rifles tight, boots fast, voices sharp. Down. Hands. Don't move. And inside, men in reflective vests bolted between pallets, one clutching a duffel bag that swung heavy with more than clothes, another trying to yank a hard drive from a rack before it could be captured. And for a few seconds the place sounded like chaos. Metal clanging, footsteps, a shouted warning in Spanish, the slap of a body hitting concrete, before it snapped into control as suspects were pinned, zip-tied, and separated. Because this wasn't the kind of raid that lingered, this was the kind of raid that cut the power and takes the brain first. Across the city, the second wave hit in sync. A DA team stormed a taxi medallion consulting office that was really a laundering desk, where spreadsheets were printed and shredded in the same hour, where cash was counted, vacuum sealed, and pushed into safe deposit pipelines. And as agents entered, a man tried to torch a stack of ledgers in a trash can, flames licking paper before an extinguisher turned the room into white dust and bitter smoke. ICE teams hit a pair of cramped apartments in the San Gabriel Valley used as migrant smuggling waypoints, not with the noise of war but with the heavy urgency of rescue, doors cracking open to reveal taped windows, bunk mattresses, and frightened people who didn't know if uniforms meant safety or another kind of cage, because in cartel corridors the line between transport and trafficking is thin and cruel. And SWAT teams hit a fortified hillside house that served as a driver dorm. Only it wasn't a dorm, it was a staging site with radios stacked in plastic bins, counterfeit IDs laid out like menus, and keys to dozens of vehicles hanging on labeled hooks the way a legitimate business would label its inventory. Back at the main fleet yard near the industrial spine of the city, dogs hit the seams of a row of taxis that looked ordinary until you saw how new the undercarriage bolts were, how cleanly the panels had been resealed, and then the cutters came out, metal screaming, panels peeled back, and the first bundles appeared, brick after brick, vacuum sealed, stamped, nested into engineered compartments behind passenger wells and fuel cavities, methamphetamine packaged to survive heat, vibration, and inspection. and then fentanyl pills, small, deadly, countless, packed inside plastic liners like candy shipped to a store, and the numbers rose with each vehicle. Dozens of pounds in one cab, more in the next, then the trucks, then the service vans. And if you're imagining a few hidden bags, erase that picture because this was mass transit repurposed into mass poisoning. By 5:02 a.m. agents had seized 8.2 tons across the first set of sites. Meth, fentanyl pills, cocaine, heroin, along with stacks of weapons that didn't belong in any taxi empire. Rifles in foam cases, pistols with extended magazines, body armor sealed in plastic, and encrypted phones lined up like a retail display. And then came the twist that changed the entire meaning of the night, because in the back of the dispatch center, behind a false wall labeled record storage, agents found a cold server closet and sealed steel boxes, not the kind of boxes used for cash, but the kind used for documents you never want traced. And when an agent cracked one open, the room went still because inside were municipal level materials, permit packets, inspection exemptions, meeting schedules, and access badges tied to transportation oversight, and mixed in with it all were encrypted hard drives and a single binder with a label that didn't look like cartel language, it looked like policy, clean fleet priority list, and under that, highlighted names, routes, and something that made seasoned investigators exchange a look that didn't say victory, it said danger, because the list wasn't just vehicles, it was protection. Who gets inspected, who gets waved through, who gets assigned favorable lanes, who gets the maintenance closure at the right time. At 6:16 a.m. the scene shifted from flashing lights and breaches to the cold hum of an FBI cyber forensics lab, where analysts worked under fluorescent glare, coffee gone bitter hours ago, and screens showed clone drives spinning through decryption attempts, and the seized dispatch server from the taxi empire fought back like it had been designed to, because it had multiple encryption layers, segmented partitions, a dead man trigger that would wipe if mishandled, and when the analysts finally cracked the first layer, and the directory tree unfolded, a single folder sat at the top like a command throne, Operation Black Meter, and inside it the truth assembled itself into a network diagram that made the room quiet, because it wasn't a list of crimes, it was an architecture. Shell companies with harmless names, Pacific Halo Mobility, Sunline Meterworks, Harborview Fleet Services, Alto Mesa Charities, ghost corporations that build each other for vehicle upgrades and driver safety training, sham nonprofit foundations that claim to fund community transit while laundering cartel revenue, restaurant chains that served as cash sinks, logistics firms that leased vehicles to wash ownership, offshore accounts that caught the money and sent it back disguised as investment capital, and the flows ran across borders like veins, payments chopped into safe sizes, routed through foreign exchanges, recombined in U.S. real estate and procurement contracts, and then the file that changed it from criminal enterprise to engineered betrayal, an authorization key tagged to a municipal user profile, an encrypted signature that kept appearing in approval logs, dispatch overrides, and inspection scheduling, and the profile name matched a public official, a Los Angeles City Council member named Marin Vale, a person who smiled at ribbon cuttings and spoke in careful sentences about modernizing transportation. And in the metadata, the analysts found her digital fingerprint on the very mechanisms that protected the fleet, rerouted loads, and shielded certain vehicles from scrutiny. And if you're listening, this is the line you cannot miss. This was not corruption, it was command-level collusion, not negligence, it was engineered treason, because the council member hadn't merely taken money, she had quietly turned municipal oversight into a defensive shield for the CJNG cartel's taxi empire, converting a city's movement system into a cartel corridor. By 7:28 a.m. investigators had the first complete picture of how it worked. Narcotics entered through multiple pressure points, port-adjacent transfers, rail, side handoffs, freeway corridor swaps, and then the fleet dispersed it the way taxis disperse passengers, dozens at a time, everywhere at once, small loads that didn't look like cartel convoys, disguised manifests in dispatch software, coded fares that were never real passengers, and if a checkpoint tightened, the system rerouted like a navigation app, sending drivers around pressure zones, parking a portion of the fleet in maintenance lots until the heat cooled, and every time the system moved successfully, it got bolder, because every day the city didn't notice became proof that the city could be used. Then came the time jump that always precedes the worst part. 4:54 a.m. the next morning, a regional command center where a wall-sized digital map glowed with dozens of red markers pulsing across Los Angeles County and surrounding metros, stretching out through Long Beach, the Inland Empire, and into neighboring corridors, each marker a node in Black Meter's ecosystem. Stash garages, laundering sites, counterfeit document mills, driver housing, narcotics transfer yards, trafficking houses, and tunnel-linked border logistics partners, and the unified mission was announced in numbers that sounded unreal but weren't in this world. Over 1,100 federal agents mobilized, dozens of SWAT teams, armored units staged for hard targets, aviation support with Black Hawk helicopters cutting low over industrial zones, DHS assets coordinating surveillance and interdiction, and an intimidation posture that included high-visibility air patrols along key corridors, because sometimes a show of force isn't for the cartel, it's for the compromised people inside the system who might be thinking about running. Raids detonated across the map in simultaneous flashes. A drug super lab disguised as an auto-detailing warehouse where chemical drums sat behind rows of wax and polish. Agents stepping through stinging fumes as presses and baggers were seized. A drug fortress mansion, tucked behind gates in a wealthy hillside pocket where a panic room hid cash and phones and a small armory. A trucking yard in the Inland Empire where 400 fleet vehicles were being rotated, re-registered, and repainted. The Empire's rolling skin. A port-adjacent office that handled false bills of lading and container diversion. A human trafficking transit house where victims were kept quiet, moved on schedules, and threatened with deportation if they spoke. A migrant smuggling convoy staged to move before sunrise, intercepted before it could disappear into freeway noise. And in each location agents seized more: methamphetamine, fentanyl pills, cocaine, heroin, guns, money, server racks, radio repeaters, and the human infrastructure that made it all run. Dispatchers, mechanics, accountants, and cartel members who had learned to wear a uniform shirt and a clip-on badge like camouflage. By 10:12 a.m. the tally expanded to match the headline scale in this story: 8.2 tons of narcotics. Across all sites, 400 fleet vehicles seized or immobilized, and financial holds triggered that approached $500 million once you counted cash, property, crypto, and business accounts. And then the operation struck its most politically radioactive target, because the corruption case required a clean capture, not a spectacle. And in a quiet mid-morning moment, federal agents served warrants that reached into government itself, and the name at the center, Council Member Marin Vale, was escorted into a secure room where the questions weren't about ideology or speeches. They were about keys, signatures, overrides, and why municipal oversight had become a cartel firewall. And the impact lines spread through the command center like a whisper nobody wanted to say too loudly. The underworld took more damage in 6 hours than it had taken in the last 6 years. But here's what made it truly dark: the part that always follows the seizures. The deep corruption reveal, because investigators began examining seized servers, patrol records, internal emails, and dispatch logs, and what they found was not a few isolated bribes but a pattern of synchronized protection. Certain enforcement units were routinely pulled away from key corridors with staffing emergencies, certain inspection teams received last-minute reassignment orders, and raid schedules leaked in fragments, enough for key targets to move phones and money before the door hit. And when the money trail was reconstructed, it showed systematic payouts. Monthly stipends routed through sham consulting firms, campaign support disguised as community donations, gift cards and cash bundles delivered through intermediary businesses. And in this case the numbers were brutal: 217 compromised personnel and affiliates across enforcement and regulatory layers. Some officers, some civilian staff, some inspectors, some clerks, a handful of low-level administrators, and a small cluster of senior planners who could shape deployments and reduce pressure exactly where the cartel needed it. And the emotional moments came from the honest ones, the people who had spent years doing it right and suddenly had to admit the system had been weaponized against them. An honest transit investigator staring at an internal email thread and realizing the warning he'd raised months earlier had been quietly forwarded to the very people it should have threatened. A detective hearing that a raid had been leaked and feeling that specific kind of betrayal that makes your throat tighten, because it's not just that someone lied. It's that they used your work to protect poison. Arrests followed inside the system itself. Senior sergeants, a deputy unit coordinator, a fleet inspection supervisor, a permit processing manager. People who didn't look like cartel members but functioned like cartel infrastructure. And the phrase that kept returning in the briefing memos was chillingly simple: parallel enforcement. A second secret police force inside the first, controlled not by the public, but by the cartel's municipal partner. Because when an official can tilt oversight and timing, they don't need to stop law enforcement. They can simply send it away at the right moment, and federal leadership said it without theatrics. The system will be rebuilt from the ground up. Then the lens widened beyond Los Angeles, because the structure of Black Meter wasn't built to serve one city, it was built to feed a continent. Routes connecting to multiple states through trucking contractors and subcontracted mobility services. Fake Green energy grants used to justify fleet modernization while hiding vehicle purchases, agricultural routes used as cover for weight and frequency, port cities used to disappear containers into the ocean of commerce, and shipping lanes intersecting with the taxi network like a ladder bridging worlds. And investigators estimated how the pipeline could have moved tons of narcotics per week without triggering alarms. Small dispersed loads, algorithmic rerouting, altered shipping manifest way. Stations closed for calibration when high-risk movements passed, and human trafficking and migrant smuggling used as cover because human movement creates chaos. Chaos creates noise, and noise hides everything. And then came the final catastrophic file, an expansion phase buried deep in Marin Vale's encrypted archive, labeled Black Meter. Permanent, describing a plan to turn the city's transportation and regulatory system into a long-term shield for CJ&G operations, a shadow administration that could survive elections by embedding itself into contracts, committees, and outsourced services, and the chilling realization landed like a slow punch. The system wasn't just infiltrated, it was being redesigned for the cartel future. And that's where the moral weight sits, because power doesn't always need open violence. Sometimes it only needs silence and ambition. Sometimes it only needs people who know how to write policy and control timing, because while the CJ&G cartel pushed methamphetamine, fentanyl pills, cocaine, and heroin through a fleet that looked like ordinary city movement, the real cost would have shown up where it always shows up, in overdoses, in broken families, in neighborhoods hollowed out by addiction and fear, in first responders arriving too late, in parents looking at a bedroom door that doesn't open anymore. And this story is a warning about political infiltration and organized crime, a reminder that a drug cartel doesn't always take a city with bullets. Sometimes it takes it with schedules, permits, and the quiet theft of oversight. So if you're still watching, tap like so more people see this story, comment expose if you want corruption dragged into the light, because silence is where these systems grow.